The Galactic Conclave had survived 40,000 years, without a single member species doing something unpredictable. 40,000 years of careful diplomacy, rehearsed speeches, unanimous votes on questions nobody argued about, and introductory ceremonies for new species that ran so smoothly they had a printed schedule, down to the minute, of exactly when the newcomers were supposed to look humbled, confused, and grateful. They handed the schedule to the human delegation on the morning of the first address. Ambassador Yara Osei read it, folded it once, and put it in her jacket pocket. The conclave assumed that meant she approved. It didn't mean she approved, which, see, the thing about humans, the thing the conclave's 37 xenosociologists had studied, documented, cross-referenced, and ultimately gotten embarrassingly wrong, was that you could observe them for 200 years and still not predict what one of them would do when she walked into the most powerful room in the known galaxy, looked at 47 alien species waiting for her to say thank you for having us, and decided in the space of a single breath that she had a better idea. The conclave asked her one question. Well, a ceremonial question, a formality. The kind of question that had one answer, had always had one answer, and existed only so the new species could say it out loud and feel like they belonged. What does your species offer the conclave? If that makes sense. Yara Osei stood at the podium, 47 civilizations watching her from their tiered seats, and she didn't give them the answer. She gave them a problem, which, and the next 6 months would determine whether that problem saved the galaxy or ended humanity's place in it before it had properly begun. The Galactic Conclave's invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Earth received it in the form of a compressed data packet delivered through a relay station near Jupiter, which meant the actual message, translated from Vethari Standard into 18 Earth languages, landed on Deputy Director Harlan's sort of Mway's desk at 3:14 in the morning, and he read it twice, put it down, poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink, and then called Ambassador Yara Osei at her apartment in Accra. She picked up on the second ring. She sounded completely awake, which told him she hadn't been sleeping. He told her Earth had been formally invited to address the Galactic Conclave at the seat of Accord, the legislative body that governed trade, conflict resolution, territorial rights, and first contact protocol for roughly 60% of the Milky Way's inhabited star systems. He told her the ceremony was in 4 months. He told her she had been chosen as lead ambassador. She basically was quiet for a moment. How many species are in the conclave? She asked. 47 full members, he said. 3 observer nations. Another pause. And what do they expect us to say? Harlan pulled up the briefing document, which was already 40 pages long and would be 240 pages long by end of day. There's a ceremonial address, he said. Every new species gives one. It's a formality. They ask you what humanity offers the conclave, and you describe your species' strengths. Military capability, technological output, resource access, cultural production. They want the highlights. Plus the pitch, basically. Like a job interview, she said. More like introducing yourself at a dinner party where everyone else has been there for 40,000 years and is very politely pretending not to be bored of each other. One more thing. Yara was quiet again. Not the quiet of someone thinking. The quiet of someone who had already thought and was now doing something else entirely in her head. Send me everything, she said. Every piece of information weave about each member species. Every trade, I guess, dispute that's been filed in the last century. Every vote record, which every alliance and every grudge. Here's the thing. Harlan looked at his glass of water. That's going to be a lot of reading. Good, she said and hung up. The next 4 months, from the outside, looked like preparation. From the inside, there was something closer to archaeology. Yara read everything. Not in the way a diplomat reads a briefing, skimming for key names, underlining relevant figures, building a mental map of who mattered and what they wanted. She read like someone trying to understand the grammar of a language she had never heard spoken. She read the conclave's founding charter, which was 9,000 years old. She read the minutes from sessions she could access, noting which species talked most which ones voted as a bloc, which ones hadn't proposed original legislation in 300 years. She read trade agreements, border settlements, the recorded testimonies from first contact ceremonies going back 60 centuries. The pattern she found wasn't one she had expected. Every species that had joined the conclave, every single one across 40,000 years, had given the same kind of address. They described what, in my opinion, they had. Plus, military strength if they were strong, economic output if they were wealthy, cultural history if they were old. It was always a description of existing assets. Always a catalog. Always, here's what we bring to the table. Please let us sit down. LOL. And the conclave always welcomed them warmly, integrated them smoothly, and within 50 years, give or take, those species had settled into a kind of comfortable irrelevance. They voted for what it's worth, which they traded. I think they attended summits, but they didn't shape anything. The conclave ran on the momentum of its oldest members, who sat at the center of every decision the way a gravity well sits at the center of an orbit. Not by forcing anything, just by being too large to ignore. She brought this observation to her team during a briefing session 6 weeks before the ceremony. There were 12 people in the room, including 2 xenolinguists, a political scientist, a trade economist, and a former general whose name everyone knew and whose judgment Yara had quietly decided to use as a check on her own instincts. She drew the pattern on the board. 60 centuries of first contact addresses. 60 centuries of new species arriving with their best credentials and leaving with a seat in the back row. What's the conclave's biggest problem right now? She asked the room. They looked at, in my opinion, each other. Plus, the trade economist, a sharp woman named Dr. Ifen, said, the Velith Corridor dispute. It's been deadlocked for 11 years. 3 species claiming overlapping territorial rights to the same 11 star systems. No violence yet, but the trade disruption is significant and getting worse. What's the proposed solution? Yara asked. There has sent one, said Dr. and Ifen. Both sides have rejected every arbitration framework offered. The conclave's mediation body has formally declared the situation unresolvable under current protocols. Yara wrote 2 words on the board, unresolvable and current. Every species that joins the conclave tells them what they have, she said. Nobody has ever walked in and told them what they could do. Not for the conclave. For a problem the conclave itself had given up on. The former general, whose name was Amara Tund, and who had spent 30 years navigating military alliances between people who hated each other, leaned back in her chair and said, You want to offer them a solution? LOL. I want to offer them a challenge, Yara said. There's a difference. The room was quiet. A solution says, we the answer, trust us. A challenge says, we think we can crack this, give us 90 days and watch. She looked at Dr. Ifen. Tell me everything there's to know about the Velith Corridor. The seat of Accord was built on a space station the size of a small moon, positioned at a gravitational midpoint between 3 of the conclave's oldest member systems. It had been expanded 17 times over 40,000 years and showed every generation of that expansion in its architecture. Smooth, ancient chambers of polished stone from the original construction nested inside, sweeping metal corridors from a middle period nested inside the newer transparent structures of more recent centuries, so that walking through it felt like walking through time while simultaneously walking through a city that had never made up its mind about what it wanted to look like. The human delegation arrived 4 days early. Plus, Yara had requested the extra time, officially for cultural acclimatization. What she actually wanted was to walk the station alone, or as close to alone as her security detail would permit, and get a feel for the place the way she got a feel for any negotiating space, through her feet, through the way sound moved, through who was sitting where in the common areas, and what they weren't talking about. On her second day, she found the Velith delegation. There were 2 of them, the Veluan and the Creathery, the 2 primary parties in the corridor dispute, and they were in the same public atrium by what she strongly suspected wasn't coincidence. The conclave had likely scheduled them there together, hoping proximity would thaw something. It hadn't. Plus, They sat on opposite sides of a fountain that cycled through colors based on the atmospheric data of its home system, and they didn't look at each other. The third party, the Mashari, who claimed the southern cluster of the disputed corridor, wasn't in the atrium. Yara had been told they rarely left their quarters during conclave sessions. Old grudge, old wound, the kind that had stopped being about land 3 generations ago and was now about the fact of the argument itself. She sat near the fountain and watched. Not the delegations, and the fountain. One of her aides, a young man named Kojo who was extremely good at blending into backgrounds, materialized beside her. The conclave orientation starts in an hour, he said. I know, she said. You're looking at the fountain, which is cool. Fun fact, the fountain cycles atmospheric data, she said. Right now, well, it's running Velith corridor data. All 11 systems in sequence. She watched the colors shift. Blue-green for a gas giant. Deep, I mean, amber for a desert world with 2 moons. White-silver for an ice system nobody had ever fully mapped. Nobody's fighting over the ice system. Kojo looked at the fountain. Because it's worthless? Because it's unmapped. They don't know what's in it. She stood up. Find me everything weave on the Mashari. Not political history. Cultural history. What do they value before they join the conclave? What do they build? What do they name things after? Oh, and real talk, the ceremony was at 0900 station time. The hall held 47 delegations in tiered, semicircular seating, each species positioned according to a seating protocol that was technically neutral and practically a precise encoding of status. The oldest members sat closest to the center. The newest sat at the outer ring, which had slightly worse acoustics, lighting that was calibrated for the most common visual spectrum rather than any one species' preferences. The human delegation sat in the outer ring. Yara didn't mind the outer ring. From the outer ring, you could see everyone. The ceremony itself ran exactly as the printed schedule described. The conclave's presiding accord, a Vethri elder named Sale who had held the position for 230 years and moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned that rushing anything was almost always the wrong choice, welcomed the human delegation with a formal speech that was warm without being emotional, precise without being cold, and exactly 11 minutes long. Yara had read 12 previous versions of this speech in her research. They were all 11 minutes long. Then came a question, what does your species offer the conclave? Sale delivered it from a standing position, hands folded, the posture of someone asking something they fully expected to receive an answer to. Yara walked to the podium. She had written 12 versions of her address. The first 11 had been variations on the standard model, a catalog of human strengths, carefully framed, honestly presented. Earth's population, its industrial capacity, its research output, its military reach. All true, all relevant. She hadn't brought those versions to the podium. Presiding accord, she said, Honored members, we are grateful for this invitation, and we've spent the last 4 months studying the conclave and what it represents. What's built across 40,000 years, which we have great respect for what we found. LOL. She paused, not for effect, because the next sentence was one she had written once in a single draft and hadn't changed. We also found the Velith corridor. The hall was quiet in the specific way. That large spaces with excellent acoustics go quiet when the sound inside them is attention and not absence. 11 years and deadlocked, formally declared unresolvable under current protocols. She let that word land. We read the arbitration records. We studied well the territorial claims. We mapped the cultural histories of all 3 parties. Another pause, and we believe it is resolvable. Not easily, not quickly, but resolvable. TBH, she could feel the quality of the silence change. 47 species recalibrating. We're not here to offer the conclave a catalog of what humanity has. We are here to make the conclave a proposal. She looked directly at Sale. Give us 90 days and access to the relevant delegations. If we can't produce a framework that all 3 parties will agree to enter negotiation under, we'll take our seat in the outer ring and say nothing more about it. If we can, we'd ask that the conclave consider what kind of asset a species might be that solves problems older members have stopped trying to solve. Fun fact, the hall didn't erupt. It wasn't that kind of place. But it did something more interesting. It exhaled, and Sale looked at Yara for a long time. Then they looked at the Velith and Krethri delegations. Then back at Yara. You understand, Sale said, that no incoming species has ever made a conditional offer at their first address. I understand, Yara said. You understand that failure, under the terms you've described, will limit humanity's standing in this body for a considerable period. I understand that too. Sale was quiet. Ambassador Osei and the conclave will deliberate. At least that's how I see it. Yara stepped back from the podium. Behind her, she heard her aide Kojo exhale through his nose in a way that was technically not a sound. Not gonna lie, the deliberation took 3 hours. Yara spent them in an anteroom with her team, none of whom spoke much. Dr. Ifen reviewed data on a tablet. General Tun sat with her arms crossed and her eyes on the middle distance, wearing the expression of someone who had spent 30 years making high-stakes decisions and had made peace with all the ways they could go wrong. Kojo organized and reorganized a set of data chips that didn't need organizing. Yara sat by the window that looked out over the station's exterior, which at this angle showed 3 different star systems visible as dense smears of light in the dark, and thought about the Moshari. She had been thinking about the Moshari for 3 weeks. Everyone who actually studied the Velith dispute focused on the Veluan and the Krethri. They were the loudest parties, the most legalistic, the ones who filed the most motions and issued the most statements. The Moshari were quieter, smaller delegation, which less combative in their public posture. Most analysts read this as weakness or diminished commitment to their claim. Yara read it as something else, and she read it as the posture of a species that wasn't primarily angry about territory. The cultural history Kojo had compiled told her this. The Moshari had been spacefaring for 600 years before the Velith dispute began. In that time, they had named almost every significant discovery after concept from their ancestral tradition of oral memory keeping. Stars were named after the archivists who recorded the old stories. Planetary systems were named after the categories of memory those archivists preserved. They didn't, name things after leaders, generals, or founding figures. They named, things after the act of remembering itself. The southern cluster of the Velith corridor, the cluster they claimed, sat directly adjacent to the unmapped ice system. The unmapped ice system that nobody was fighting over. The conclave had announced it unresolvable because they had assumed all 3 parties wanted the same thing. The 11 inhabited or habitable systems of the corridor, valued for their resources and strategic position. And 2 of them did. But the Moshari had filed their claim 60 years after the other 2, which meant something had changed 60 years ago. Something had appeared on their maps that hadn't been there before. Yara had a hypothesis about what that was. She hadn't shared it with anyone yet because she wanted to be in a room with a Moshari delegate before she said it out loud. The conclave's response came in the form of Sale's personal aide, who appeared in the doorway of the anteroom and said that the presiding accord would see Ambassador Osei. Alone, not the full team. Alone. Yara stood, straightened her jacket, and walked out. The room Sale met her in was smaller than the main hall. Older, one of the original chambers with the polished stone walls and low ceilings of the conclave's founding generation. It felt like being inside something that had decided what it was a very long time ago and hadn't needed to reconsider. Sale was seated. They gestured for Yara to sit. The conclave has been discussing your address, Sale said. There's significant disagreement pretty much about how to respond. I expected that, Yara said. Some members believe you've been presumptuous and arrogant, even that an incoming species has no standing to make pronouncements about disputes between full members. That's a fair reading. Some members believe you're either very confident or very foolish, and they're not certain which. A pause, measured and precise. A smaller number believe you may have actually read the Velith file carefully enough to have something worth hearing. Sale looked at her directly. I'm the third group. Barely. The thing is, Yara waited, and I'm going to grant you 90 days, Sale said. Not because I guess the conclave voted to. They didn't vote. I am granting it under my executive discretion as presiding accord, which Ivan T. used in 43 years. A very slight shift in posture. Not quite a warning, not quite curiosity. Something between. Plus, if you produce nothing, it will reflect on my judgment as well as yours. I want you to understand that. What's interesting is I understand it, Yara said. What do you well need? She had a list ready. 3 meetings with the Moshari delegation, private and off the record. Access to the conclave's full survey data on the Velith corridor, including any surveys conducted in the last 80 years. A neutral space where all 3 parties could be brought without the presence of conclave mediators. Because the conclave's mediators were part of the reason the situation had calcified, every party having learned to play to the institutional audience rather than to each other. Sale listened to all of it. The Moshari won't agree to meet with you, Sale said. They actually might not, Yara said. Ask them anyway. Tell them I want to ask about the ice system. Funny enough, something moved across Sale's face that was too brief and too alien for Yara to name. The ice system, actually, Sale said. The unmapped one, in the northern quadrant of the corridor. Survey designation Velith, North 7. She held Sale's gaze. Nobody's been in there in 80 years, and tell the Moshari I want to talk about what's in there. And then see what they say. Sale was quiet for a long time. You've been doing a great deal of reading, they said finally. Humans read, Yara said. It's one of the things we do. She stood. Sale didn't stop her, which, outside the chamber, in the corridor with its layers of architectural history stacked against each other like geological strata, Kojo was waiting. He looked at her face, and he had known her long enough to read it. They said yes, he said. They said I mean yes. He exhaled again, the same way as before, technically not a sound. Now what? Now, Yara said, walking. We go find out if I'm right about the Moshari. And we do it before I've bet Sale's 200-year reputation on a hypothesis Ivan T. actually tested. How long do we've? About 6 hours before the conclave social dinner, where every delegation will be in the same room, and the Moshari will spend the entire event standing near walls and declining to be introduced to anyone. I gotta say, so 6 hours. 5.5. Look, want to change my jacket first. Kojo made a note. Around them, the seat of Accord hummed with the particular quiet of a place that had absorbed 40,000 years of consequence and was preparing, entirely without knowing it, to absorb a little more. The Moshari, agreed to meet. It took Sale 40 minutes to get a response from their delegation after Yar's request was delivered, which was fast, much faster than expected, which told Yar 2 things. First, that Velith North 7 was exactly what she thought it was. Second, that the Moshari had been waiting for someone to ask about it for a long time, and the waiting had made them very still in the way that things under pressure go still. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Until then, Yara had the social dinner. The conclave's social dinners operated under a specific protocol that was theoretically informal and practically anything, but species were grouped by atmospheric tolerance. You couldn't seat a methane breather next to an oxygen breather without a good deal of environmental engineering, and within those groupings, the seating assignments were made by the conclave's protocol office using a formula that had been refined over millennia to ensure that every delegation was equidistant from every other delegation in terms of access and proximity to the center tables. Diplomatically neutral, I think, which socially fossilized. Nobody sat next to anyone by accident. The Moshari stood near the eastern wall, slightly apart from their assigned table, in the low blue spectrum light they preferred. There were 4 of them. They were tall and narrow-built, with long limbs that moved in a way that always looked like they were deciding whether to gesture and then changing their mind. Their coloring was a muted silver gray, which in different light could look almost translucent. Yara had read that the Moshari didn't shake hands, didn't bow, didn't make the kind of sustained eye contact that most of the Conclave's human-adjacent species defaulted to in formal social settings. What they did, when they were comfortable, when they chose to extend trust, was address you by the name of something you had made. Not your personal name. The name of, in my opinion, a thing your hands or your mind had built. It was basically the closest translation the xenolinguists could manage for a greeting. That had no clean equivalent in any Earth language. You were the sum of what you had created. Yara walked toward them with Kojo 3 steps behind her. She honestly stopped at a distance that the briefing notes described as the Moshari preferred approach zone. Far enough to be non-threatening, close enough to be intentional. The nearest Moshari looked at her. Their eyes were large and dark and not unkind. "I'm Yara Osei," she said. "I'm a human ambassador. Plus, I asked to speak with you tomorrow about Velith North 7. I wanted to introduce myself tonight, so the morning didn't have to start cold." The Moshari was quiet. This was normal, which their processing time for social language was longer than most species in the Conclave, which had historically been misread as unfriendliness and was actually something closer to the opposite. They listened so completely that they couldn't do anything else while they were doing it. Then the Moshari said, in heavily accented Conclave standard, "You are the maker of the Velith proposal." "Yes," she said. "You named the Northern Ice System in your list of requests." "Yes." Another long quiet. The 3 other Moshari had oriented toward her without moving. It was the way they paid attention, with their whole bodies, without the pretense of looking away. "You know something?" the first one said. "Plus, not a question. To be fair, a hypothesis," she said. "I think I know why you filed your territorial claim 60 years after the Veluan and the Crethery, when you could have filed it at the start. I think I know what changed 60 years ago that made this southern cluster matter to you in a way it hadn't before. And I think that thing, whatever it is in Velith North 7. The Moshari looked at her for a long time. "Tomorrow," they said. "We will speak tomorrow." Then they turned back to the wall, which wasn't rudeness. It was the Moshari equivalent of nodding. Yara walked back to her team's table, which Kojo materialized beside her. "That went well," he said. He had watched from distance and couldn't hear the exchange. "That went well," she said. "How can you tell?" "They said we'd speak tomorrow. Before I asked them, that means they were already deciding whether to talk to me, and they made the decision while I was standing there." She picked up a glass of something pale yellow that the server had described as a flavor harmless to human biology. "They're not angry at us. They're tired of not being understood. Isn't that the same thing, eventually?" She thought about it. "Only if nothing changes," she said. The meeting room Sale had arranged was one of the original stone chambers, which suited the Moshari. They had specified low light, minimal furniture, and no recording devices. The last condition, I guess, was the one that had caused the most debate in the Conclave's protocol office, who had never helped with an unrecorded diplomatic meeting and found the concept somewhere between alarming and incomprehensible. Yara had basically agreed to all 3 conditions without hesitation. There, were 3 Moshari in the room. The one who had spoken to her at the dinner. 2 others. No names had been exchanged. She had been briefed that Moshari personal names were private in professional contexts and were never offered first. You waited to be given one, and you might never be. Yara had brought Dr. Ifen for the, to be fair, Data, and Kojo, because she always brought Kojo. She had left General Tund outside in the corridor because Tund had a presence that read as military even when she was trying not to, and this wasn't a moment for anything that read as military. She sat, and the Moshari stood. This look was their preference, and she didn't question it. "I want to tell you what I think I know," she said, "and I want you to tell me where I'm wrong. I'd rather be wrong in this room than wrong later." The thing is, the Moshari representative, the tall one who had spoken to her the night before, made a gesture with their right hand that the briefing notes identified as agreement to proceed. Yara laid it out. 60 years ago, a Moshari deep survey vessel had mapped the edge of Velith, North 7, the ice system that nobody was contesting. The survey had been logged with the Conclave's cartographic registry, but the data was classified under the originating species privacy protocols, which meant no other Conclave member could access it without Moshari consent. The survey data had never been released. When the Moshari filed their territorial claim to the Southern Corridor Cluster 2 years after that survey, the Conclave's analyst had connected no dots. Because there appeared to be no dots to connect, North 7 was useless ice, too far from the disputed systems to be strategically relevant, classified anyway. But 60 years ago also coincided with something else. A Moshari cultural event. The death of the last living oral historian of the Kareth tradition, the oldest surviving lineage of Moshari memory keepers. With her death, the Moshari had lost the final living connection to 1,400 years of oral record. They had partial written transcriptions. They had fragments. What they didn't have was the full living chain of memory, which in their tradition could only be transmitted from one keeper to the next in person, in voice, and couldn't be reconstructed from written text alone. The survey of Velith, North 7 had happened 4 months before the last Kareth historian died. I think your survey found something in the Northern Ice system, Yara said. Something that predates your spacefaring period. Plus, something that might be connected to the Kareth tradition or to a period of Moshari history that the Kareth historians were preserving. She kept her voice level. I think you filed a claim to the Southern Corridor Cluster because it was the closest territorial foothold you could establish to the Northern Ice system under Conclave law. Because you can't claim a system you've properly surveyed and registered, and you weren't ready to register North 7. But you needed to be in the region, close enough to protect access. One more thing, the room was very quiet. The Moshari representative looked at her for a long time. You read very carefully, they said at last. We're good at patterns, she said. Umans. We've been finding shapes in random things since we lived in caves. It's not always useful. Sometimes it's exactly useful. A pause. Then, there's a structure in Velith, North 7, beneath the ice of the second planet. Old, which very old. I think older than our spacefaring. Older than the Conclave. Their voice was careful and not entirely steady. We don't know who built it. We know that the Kareth oral record contained references to a place they called the Fur Silence. A place their tradition said was where the oldest stories came from. Not metaphor. Physical location. Our historians believed for centuries it was myth. And then you found it, Yara said. And then we found it, they said. And there it was. Not a territorial dispute. A recovery mission. The Moshari hadn't been fighting over 11 star systems of real estate. They had been fighting to stay close enough to a ruin under the ice of an unmapped world that might contain the oldest material record of their own history. They couldn't say so publicly because if they registered the discovery, every archaeological body in the Conclave would descend on it, and the Moshari would lose control of something they hadn't yet begun to understand. Yara looked at Dr. Pretty Much Ifen. Dr. Ifen was looking at her datapad with an expression that meant she had run the numbers and was currently revising every assumption she had walked into the room with. What do the Veluan and Krethri actually want from the Southern Cluster? Yara asked. Thorium deposits in the 4th system, the Moshari representative said, and a transit corridor through the 6th system for shipping lanes. Not the 3rd system, not the basically 7th. No. So for the 3 systems closest to North 7's approach vector are of no interest to either of them. Correct. Yara did the geometry in her head. 3 systems, no thorium, no shipping value, no one else's priority. A clean territorial claim for the Moshari that gave them the approach corridor to the Northern Ice system without touching anything the other 2 parties cared about. In exchange, the Moshari's presence in the region stopped being a threat to Veluan and Krethri interests, which meant the other 2 parties could negotiate the thorium and the shipping lanes without the Moshari acting as an unpredictable variable. The reason nobody had solved this in 11 years was that nobody had known to ask the right question. The right question wasn't what do you want from the corridor. The right question was why do you want to be near it at all? I need to ask you something, Yara said. And I need you to know that the answer you give me will stay in this room. Not because I'm promising you secrecy. I can't promise that forever, and it wouldn't be honest to try. But because what you're protecting deserves to be protected carefully, and I don't think revealing it publicly is necessary for what I'm about to propose. The Moshari waited. If I can get you a clean territorial corridor to North 7, 3 systems, uncontested, formally registered, will you enter negotiation with the Veluan and the Krethri for the rest? Silence. Actually a long one. Plus, honestly, the representative looked at the other two Moshari. Something passed between them that didn't involve sound or visible gesture, and that Yara made no attempt to interpret. Then, yes, the representative said, we will negotiate. The next 7 weeks were the most demanding of Yara's professional life, which had included a hostage negotiation in Lagos, a trade arbitration that had nearly collapsed 3 times before succeeding on its 4th attempt, and a border commission that had run for 2 years and produced a document that everyone hated equally, which was the only way border commissions ever actually worked. The Velith negotiation was harder than any of those because it required keeping 3 parties in motion simultaneously while none of them knew the full picture. The Moshari couldn't reveal the structure under the ice. Not yet. Not without losing control of the process. The Veluan and Krethri couldn't know that their primary competitor in the corridor had goals that hadn't thing to do with competing with them, because if they knew that, they'd immediately try to exploit it. What Yara needed was a framework where each party got what they genuinely needed while believing the agreement had been reached on the terms they had publicly stated. Not deception, which architecture. The kind of agreement building where the structure holds, because every load-bearing element is real, even if not everyone can see the whole blueprint at once. To be fair, she split her team. Dr. Ifen ran the economic modeling, mapping the thorium access, and shipping lane options for the Veluan and Krethri into a configuration that maximized their actual gains, which were, as it turned out, substantially better in certain arrangements than in the ones they had been insisting on, because 11 years of positional bargaining had calcified their demands around opening offers rather than underlying needs. General Tund worked the security concerns, which were real on the Krethri side, had been inflated by their legal team into something twice as large as they needed to be. Kojo managed the logistics of keeping 3 sets of delegates in separate rooms, at separate times, with separate refreshments appropriate to their atmospheric requirements, which was a TBH challenge he attacked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every small friction in a negotiation could become a reason to walk out. Yara held the Moshari thread herself. She met with them every 3 days in the same stone chamber with the same conditions. They weren't easy meetings. The Moshari representative, who had never offered a name, but whose colleagues had begun addressing in her presence as though she were entitled to hear it, which was its own kind of progress, was precise and careful and deeply skeptical of institutions in the specific way that species with long memories of being misunderstood become skeptical. Every concession Yara proposed was examined for secondary implications. Every guarantee was tested for its enforceability under 3 different scenarios where the guarantee might fail. It was, Yara thought, the most thorough negotiating she had ever faced. That they didn't trust easily, which they trusted completely or not at all, and the movement from one to the other was slow and not linear and required showing up exactly the same way every time, which was harder than it sounded across 7 weeks on a space station far from home. On the 49th day, the Moshari representative said something that hadn't appeared in any briefing document or cultural analysis. In the Kareth tradition, they said, there's a category of memory keeper called a bridge voice. This is not an archivist. An archivist preserves. A bridge voice carries knowledge between 2 groups who don't share a language for what they know, who have the same experience on each side of a wall, but no words that reach across. A pause. We haven't had one in the conclave in a very long time. Yara didn't say anything. You are doing the work of a bridge voice, the representative said. I want you to know that we see this. It was the closest thing to a compliment the Moshari had offered in 7 weeks. Yara understood it was also a kind of formal acknowledgement, a naming of what she was doing, which in their tradition meant they had accepted it as real. "Thank you," she said. "Do not let the conclave make you into an archivist," they said. "The conclave has many archivists. Plus, they don't have enough bridge voices." On the 71st day of Yara's 90-day window, the framework agreement was ready. It wasn't a final treaty. Plus, it was something more important, a structure that all 3 parties had agreed to enter, which meant they had agreed to keep talking inside a defined set of rules rather than continuing to talk past each other in the open space of unstructured antagonism. The Velith corridor would be divided into 3 zones of primary administration, with shared resource access, rights negotiated on a rolling 20-year basis. The thorium systems went to the Veluan under a joint extraction agreement that gave the Krethri guaranteed shipping access in exchange for security cooperation. The transit corridor the Krethri wanted was routed through a path that avoided all 3 of the systems the Moshari had been quietly protecting. The Moshari's 3 northern systems were registered as a protected research zone under a conclave heritage protocol that Yara had identified in a footnote of the founding charter and that had never been applied to a living species claim before, only to ruins. She had spent a week arguing with the conclave's legal body about whether it applied. She had won by pointing out that the charter's language specified sites of historical significance without limiting the definition to species no longer present, and that the conclave's own principles of member sovereignty required deferring to the Moshari's assessment of what constituted their historical heritage. Sale had watched that argument from the back of the room with the expression of someone watching a student answer a question the teacher hadn't entirely expected to be answerable. On basically the morning of the 72nd day, Yara presented the framework to Sale privately. Not the full conclave. Not yet. Sale needed to see it before it went into the room, because Sale had extended executive discretion on this, and Yara wasn't going to blindside the person who had taken the largest institutional risk on her behalf. Sale read it, which all of it, twice. The Heritage Protocol application, they said, and that has never been done. And, honestly, the charter doesn't say it can't be, Yara said. The conclave legal body agreed. Reluctantly, yes. Sale set the document down on the table between them. 3 parties in agreement to enter formal negotiation. 11 years of deadlock, 72 days. Another of those precise, long pauses. "How did you know about the ICE system?" "I didn't know," she said. "I had a hypothesis, I guess, and I asked." The hypothesis was right. She met Sale's gaze. Honestly, the harder part wasn't knowing. Once I knew what the Moshari actually needed, the rest was just logistics. "Just logistics," Sale repeated. "Very complicated logistics." Not gonna lie, what was the harder part? Before the knowing, she thought about it. Being willing to ask a question that sounded wrong, she said. Everyone basically who looked at the Velith dispute saw 3 parties fighting over the same territory, which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Asking about TBH, the ICE system felt like a non sequitur. It felt like I'd missed the point. I almost didn't ask. She paused. Humans, TBH, have a problem where we're afraid of asking the wrong question in front of people who know more than we do. We'd rather stay quiet than sound foolish. One more thing, and yet you asked, Sale said. I decided sounding foolish was recoverable. Plus, being wrong about the Moshari for another decade wasn't. Sale was quiet for a long time. They had a way of being quiet that felt like processing rather than absence. You could sense the gears turning without being able to hear them. Ambassador Osei, they said finally, I've been presiding a court for 230 years. In that time, I've watched many species join the conclave. I've watched them give their addresses, take their seats, and find their level in this body. Most of for what it's worth, them find a level quickly and stay there. Another pause. You gave us something at your address that I haven't seen in a very long time. You gave us a problem framed as an invitation, not a threat. Plus, not a boast. An invitation to watch you work. They folded their hands. The conclave will discuss what it's watched. What do you think they'll say? Yara asked. I think they will say a great many things. Some of them will be alarmed. Newcomers who solve old problems make long-standing members uncomfortable because it raises questions about why those members didn't solve the problems themselves. A slight shift in sales posture. The most human thing Yara had ever seen them do. But I think, they will say that humanity is more interesting than they expected. More interesting than expected, Yara said. I'll take it. In my opinion, the framework was presented to the full conclave on day 74. All 47 delegations were in the hall. The outer ring seats, where the human delegation sat, felt slightly less distant than they had on the day of the first address. Or maybe that was just Yara, whose relationship to the room had changed even if the room hadn't. She presented the framework the way she had built it, clearly, without overselling, acknowledging the work that remained. The framework was a beginning. The 20-year rolling agreements would require sustained negotiation. The heritage, protocol application for the northern systems would require precedent-setting deliberation that the conclave legal body was already not entirely happy about. Nothing was done. Plus, a door had been opened. The Veluan delegation voted to accept the framework immediately. The Cree took 2 hours and came back with minor language adjustments that weren't unreasonable. The Moshari, in the first public vote they had cast on the Velith dispute in 11 years, voted yes in a voice that was quiet and even and completely certain. The hall recorded the vote without ceremony, because that was how the conclave did things. Afterward, in the corridor outside the main chamber, the Moshari representative stopped beside Yara. They didn't touch her. Moshari didn't touch outside their own delegation. They stopped and looked at her directly, which she had come to understand was the most deliberate form of attention they offered. Oh, say who makes bridges, they said. It wasn't her name. It was the maker name. The thing, her hands or mind had built. The Moshari greeting extended to her as though she had earned it. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she had wanted it. Thank you, she said. The representative made the agreement to proceed gesture with their right hand, which meant something slightly different in this context, more like it is already done, and walked away. Kojo was at her elbow. Plus, what did they call you? A bridge voice, she said. More or less. He was quiet. Then, is that good? Real talk, yes, she said. That's very good. They walked back through the layered corridors of the Seat of Accord, through its centuries of accumulated stone and metal and glass, toward the suite where the rest of the team was waiting, and the next problem. There was always a next problem, had probably already arrived in the form of a data packet requiring review. Somewhere behind her, 47 civilizations were updating their assessments of humanity based on the last 74 days. Some of those updates would be warm. Plus, some would be cautious. Some would be the specific wariness of species who had just watched a newcomer do something they hadn't managed in 11 years and were still deciding how to feel about that. All of those assessments were fine. The conclave had asked what humanity offered, and the answer, it turned out, wasn't on any list of assets or capabilities or resource figures. It wasn't basically in population numbers or military tonnage or technological output. It was in the willingness to ask about the ice system. It was in showing up, reading everything, sitting with uncertainty long enough to form a question that sounded wrong, and then asking it anyway. It was in the bridge work, in the corridor behind them, through 3 atmospheric barriers and a wall of sound-dampening material. The Velith corridor wasn't yet solved. But it was, moving, which 3 species who hadn't spoken honestly to each other in 11 years were now inside a framework that required them to. The Moshari would begin the careful, complicated process of revealing what was under the ice at North 7 on their own terms, in their own time, with a heritage protection that had never existed before and now did because a first-year ambassador from Earth had read a footnote in a 9,000-year-old charter and decided it was worth arguing about. Kojo said, the second data packet from Director Moyes arrived. You want a full debrief. Tell him we'll send a report in 48 hours. He said he wants it in 24. Tell him 48, Yaris said. We have something to do first. What? She stopped walking, looked at the window at the end of the corridor, at the familiar smears of distant stars. We're going to go look at North 7 survey data, she said. The real data. The Mashari are going to show us what they found. As a gesture of, the word they used was recognition. Kojo was quiet for a moment. And what do you think we'll find in there, honestly? Yara smiled at the stars. I have a hypothesis, she said.